Good evening, my friends, and welcome to the Black Mysteries of KaalBhairav Jayanti. Now, it's been a while since I've done one of these, and this night we're trying something different. Instead of me reading some of my previous work, I'll be mostly freestyling it. We'll see if this improves things in terms of the mean number of digressions per minute. Now, first and foremost, what is KaalBhairav Jayanti? Well, if we're going to translate it literally, it would be something along the lines of the glorious victory, or birthday, of terrifying black time death. This is because Bhairava is reasonably straightforward as terror, but Kaal is, it's quite a complex term. Mostly it's translated as death, so if you've heard the Robert Oppenheimer bit at Trinity Sands, where he says, "And now I'm become death, the shatterer of worlds," the word he's translating as death is, of course, Kaal. However, it's a bit more complex than that in truth, because it also means time and blackness, and it can also mean iron. So to the person who said the glorious victory or birthday of terrifying black time death sounded incredibly metal, yes, it does. It likely derives from Proto-Indo-European Kaal, which refers to a veil or a covering. And that therefore informs quite strongly the sense of it not only as time, but also as death, because of course the night, the blackness, acts as a sort of a veil between the periods of daylight, and also is the veil beyond which we cannot see, which is death when you sort of go off into the night. But more upon that in some other time, and probably several other pieces. Now, in order to make this relevant, I suppose, for those of you out there who are not, for some reason, Hindu, but are still part of the great Indo-European religious family, we're also going to be looking at both the, I suppose you might say, the co-occurrences of the same myth which underpins KaalBhairav Jayanti in other Indo-European cultures, basically just the Greek for now, and also what I believe to be the Proto-Indo-European myth which underpins all of this. And in fact, we're going to do it in exactly the opposite order to how I just laid things out. We'll start out with the Proto-Indo-European Reconstruction. Then we'll take a look at some of the Greek comparative examples, and then we'll work our way through from the very early Vedic presentation of the myth through to the somewhat later Puranic rendition, which effectively is the reason for the season tonight. So, to start out, that Proto-Indo-European typology. Now, the way I've constructed this is by reviewing quite extensively the evidence which we have to hand, and that isn't just the various Hellenic or Hindu myths which we have, but also quite an extensive suite of other material. I accept that other reconstructions of some details are possible, but I do think I'm pretty much on the money with this one. Effectively, what we have is the Sky Father, Dios Pitar, otherwise known as Zeus Pater, Jupiter, or of course Odin. The Sky Father acts in defense of a particular goddess. This goddess, broadly speaking, is his female counterpart, his wife. Now, why he's having to defend her, there's two layers to it. The first one is quite obvious. I mean, this is his wife, this is his love. Of course he's going to defend her. But second, and implicit to this, is that the goddess in question tends to represent an in-universe expression, if you like, of cosmic order. What we would in Sanskrit call Rita, or in Old Norse it would be orlog, literally supernal law. There's a variety of terms in ancient Greek which are probably quite relevant here. Dikaosune would be one, which I always tend to mention because it derives from one of my many favourite Proto-Indo-European particles, dake. Dake, it means to point. It turns up in dictator. It also turns up via the DT sound shift in teach, and in a slightly altered format in vindication and vengeance, which come to us from Latin vindex. I also tend to whip it out when we wind up with some certain theological arguments, because it can phrase these as being what you might call a dake measuring contest, a contest of who's more right about certain things. Anyway, in terms of this goddess, who, as I've said, tends to be a sort of an in-universe expression of cosmic order, she's under threat from an interloper, we might call him, another deific figure, or well, I wouldn't necessarily say a demon per se, but certainly acting in a rather demonic manner because, of course, this interloper is placing cosmic order under threat. Not just by directly threatening the goddess in question with rape, effectively, but also by doing so in a manner that is, especially heinous, which violates sort of natural law. Now, in the Vedic example that we're going to be discussing, the way this is phrased is the interloper is Prajapati, who attempts to rape his daughter, variously identified as, Diva would be the appropriate term to use here, which is sort of a female form of the noun Dios. So it's the female equivalent to Dios, as of course we'd expect. So the fact that it's incest, which is being engaged in by Prajapati, this is why it constitutes such an egregious violation, as we'll get to when we cover the Vedic example. So, in the Proto-Indo-European example, we have three figures which we can say are there. The Skyfather, or possibly the Skyfather's emissary, this goddess, cosmic order sort of incarnate, and this interloper. We've set out the positional relationships between the three. So the Skyfather is married to the goddess in question, or otherwise is closely associated. The interloper is attempting to interfere with this goddess, does so in a manner that, in both senses of the term, violates cosmic order, thus necessitating both sanction and defensive action to be undertaken. And that's where things get rather interesting for the purposes of KaalBhairav Jayanti. Now, there's a number of ways that we can reconstruct what then ensues. One way is the Skyfather himself directly showing up and either via axe or spear or shooting somebody with a bow and arrow, he beats back this attempted interloper and leads it so that this interloper can no longer render a threat to his beloved. Other versions of the myth instead have an emissary, as I've said, either a hunting dog or some sort of emanation or champion, you might sort of say. So Virabhadra, as we'll be meeting, KaalBhairav, of course, is the reason for the season, and other such figures are kind of that latter sort of typology, although at the same time, you can sort of co-identify them with Rudra to a certain extent, so it all sort of fits together. The interesting figure about this, of course, is that there tends to be quite a strong canine or wolf association for either the Skyfather or his emissary in this particular circumstance. This is identified with the star known as Sirius, and we can tell this is the case because various Indo-European mythologies are behaving themselves as applies this particular identification. You can find more about that in my various articles looking at Sirius. But in any case, we should probably move on and start looking at the actual Greek mythology so that we can start seeing how this all fits together. Now, the Greek expression of this is convoluted and complex, but then I suppose that's quite a lot of Greek mythology. It's not to say that the Greek or Hellenic perception of things is false per se. Well, some of them are more true than others. The trouble is, the Greeks had such an incredible literary culture. They had all these absolute titans, perhaps a poor choice of words. They had all these wonderful mythologists who wandered around the place collecting versions of stories. And that's a very important thing to do, don't get me wrong. But the trouble is, they then wind up with these slightly differing accounts from, sort of this group over here and this group over here. And they'd wind up putting them back together in ways that could occasionally obscurate what was actually going on with the, I suppose you might say, the more succinct or more supernal version of the myth. This isn't just a Greek problem. It happens also in the Hindu sphere. It happens in the Romans. It happens just about everywhere there are humans. It's a very difficult thing to avoid. So, for example, and this is slightly off topic, but it does relate because, of course, same deity. You wind up with, in Roman times, records talking about Dionysus, which seems logical, except they're not quite sure whether the 4 or so Dionysus figures that they have are really quite the same god. In fact, it becomes quite a point of controversy, so they actually sort of need to set down, okay, yes, so the official position in the Roman Empire, broadly speaking, is we should probably reckon that this Dionysus over here, this Dionysus over here, this Zagreus over here, this other guy, sort of Bacchus, Liber, and of course the Sabazeos worshipped by the Thracians. Yeah, we can kind of reckon that's the same god, although obviously there's been some narrative progression, so therefore the first one manifests, then there's the second one, then there's the third one, and that's how we reconcile the differences in the various mythologies. It's not a bad attempt at, I suppose you could say, putting things back together, but then you wind up with difficulty, because some people don't necessarily get the memo about some of these things, and as we see with, say, Dionysus and Hades, while there was an archaic Greek perception that these were in fact the same god, it had wound up fading significantly by the height of the classical age, so you wind up with people going, yeah, okay, so those guys over there who think that Dionysus is Hades, yeah, it's a bit strange what they're doing, you know what I mean? Although, of course, with our Proto-Indo-European and comparative Indo-European mythology hats on, perhaps it's an invisible helmet, we can tell that, yeah, this is actually a completely correct perception. A similar thing happens when it comes to the parentage of Dionysus, whereby, despite the fact that the dominant perception, especially today with our slightly pop-cultural sort of versions of these things, is that Dionysus' mother was Semele, there's actually a number of more archaic traditions also found within the Greek legendarium, wherein the mother of Dionysus is a figure like Persephone. Now, this is rather interesting for a number of reasons, but we've covered that in other pieces, so we won't go into it here. But I did mention that for a particular reason, which is that you'll find that Semele does actually wind up showing up later on in our typology in the Greek expression, but more upon that in a moment. Why I walked through all of that is because we're about to meet 3 or 4 different Greek versions of what I believe to be the same myth. Except at least one of these is doing double or even triple duty, so therefore it's brought together several different myths in combination, and that's led to a bit of obscuration of some of the essential characteristics. That myth concerns Orion, my favourite constellation, partially because it's the only one I can easily recognise. But in terms of Orion, there's 2 ways to look at Orion relative to the goddess we've mentioned earlier, in this particular case, Artemis. And I should mention that, if you want to find more detail about how Artemis represents a sort of a expression, immanentization of cosmic order, I've written several articles upon the subject earlier this year, which I thoroughly endorse checking out. I will probably record some of those later on. But in terms of Orion, there's 2 ways to look at Orion in relation to Artemis. Now, the first one, which isn't so relevant for this particular myth, is Orion as the lover of Artemis. This is the one which has Orion effectively as, like Artemis, a hunter without compare. And in that particular form of the myth, he effectively winds up being killed by, the sting of Scorpio. Now, as I've covered elsewhere, my belief is that what's going on there, if we consider who sends Scorpio to kill Orion, it's sent usually by Gaia. There's some other, I think, at least one myth in which Artemis might send her herself. I'll have to check that. But what's going on there, if we then bring in the Vedic comparative evidence, is a general Indo-European mythic typology wherein the Skyfather actually winds up having a bit of a rocky patch in his marriage, and therefore being killed by the mother goddess. We see this, for example, when Kali, that sort of female death, you might sort of say, winds up dancing over the top of Shiva when she's in a sort of a literally omnicidal rage. There's various other expressions of the typology which we won't go into for tonight, but suffice to say that because the Scorpion's tail part of the constellation is closely identified in the more archaic Vedic Jyotisha manuals with Prithvi or Nirti, we can reasonably determine that there's a Proto-Indo-European understanding for the mother goddess. I hesitate to say Earth Mother because much more to her than just Earth, but the mother goddess has some linkage to this Scorpion's tail, and as we've seen, it kills this particular celestial archer. That archer, in this particular instance, quite likely being identifiable with Rudra for reasons which I discussed in the second Dionysus piece I wrote late last year. More on that some other time. So we're just going to park that over to the side because that's one understanding of Orion and Artemis's situation, and it's not the one which is actually useful here. That, by contrast, is the other understanding, which has Orion not as a lover of Artemis, but instead as sort of a quite chaotic. Well, chaotic is quite the right word, I suppose. A chaotic force that's trying to interfere with Artemis. That's sort of trying to track down and violate her and her nymphs and other things of that nature. Now, in this version of the myth, so it's a different figure, just happens to be co-identified with the same name, we might sort of say, in the same constellation. In this version of the myth, it's Apollo, again an archer, and that's rather important, who shoots and kills Orion to protect his sister. Now, the situation around Apollo, and for that matter Artemis, is quite a complex one in Indo-European comparative mythological terms. The logical way to look at it, of course, is to take some of the Greek mythology at face value. Always a risky thing to do with myth, but we'll chance it. In those particular tellings, we would therefore have Zeus as father of Apollo by a particular wife, you might sort of say. Leto, I believe, is the name. I've covered why that means wife quite literally in the relevant Western Anatolian language elsewhere in my work. But effectively, it would therefore have Apollo as a son of Zeus. This would cause some slight issues for our typology because, of course, Rudra is Dyaus. There's repeated Rigvedic statements about this. What I suspect has happened is that a particular Vedic, or Hindu we should say, family tree, which has the Sky Father as Surya, the sun, logical thing for Dyaus, because of course the daylight is literally there in the Dyaus sort of term. The Sky Father has a number of children, especially with Chaya and of course Saranyu. And one of these sets of children is a pair of twins, that being Shani, another archer figure, and Bhadra. Bhadra is a goddess of the hunt. Now, it is not hard at all to see how Shani and Bhadra resonate somewhat with this notion of Zeus fathering twins, one of whom happens to be a hunting goddess, and the other one of which happens to be a prominent archer, who also upholds cosmic order and does so in quite a sort of an ineffable and rather disconcerting way. Well, scary way, we should possibly say. So what I suspect has happened is that particular sort of understanding has become conflated with another set of understandings wherein Apollo actually appears to carry a bunch of mythic elements with him, which appear to suggest that he is also a resonancy of the Skyfather deific. We'll discuss that at some other time. We'll just sort of take it as read for the moment. But for those of you who may be wondering how there can be two or even more Skyfathers in a particular pantheonic setup, it's because of that aforementioned situation whereby the mythology becomes refracted as it develops, and of course as people go around putting back together things from this or that particular tribe. Now we can tell this has happened in part by looking at another manifestation or manifestations of Zeus. The Zeus Triophthalmos concept, which I often bring up, Zeus the three-eyed. Very Rudran, that Triambaka indeed. We find this mentioned in Pausanias, I think there may be some other source material on it, whereby Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon are all actually three forms of the same deity. This is a completely accurate and insightful classical understanding. It had fallen off the radar elsewhere within the classical world, of course, but at the same time you can still glimpse it if you know how to look, both in terms of the mythology when it's subject to a comparative analysis, but also via stuff like, in Latin terms, for example, that figure Dis Pater, underworld deity, but with a name like Dis Pater, well, it's not hard to see how Dieos Pitare is obviously meant, even though ostensibly the dis particle should mean, I think, something along the lines of wealthy father, but it comes from that same Dieos root, if memory serves. The point is, it's not a contradiction to view certain myths where Apollo shows up as having the imprinting of a Skyfather figure rampaging around in them. Now, in terms of Apollo and Rudra, we can identify many points of coterminity between the two, so it's a pretty standard co-identification. One which is particularly relevant for tonight's proceedings is, of course, the understanding of Apollo as having quite a lupine association. There's particular theonyms, there's other points of association, so there's that wolf understanding quite strongly bound up here. A wolf or a hunting dog, we might sort of say, and of course he's acting as a hunter, in this particular case of the figure who's attempting to interfere with his sister. Now, I'd earlier suggested that the Proto-Indo-European form of the myth has the Sky Father protecting his wife. And straight away, especially because of the incest sort of situation with Prajapati and the Vedic understanding, somebody should be asking, okay, so what's going on with Artemis then? The first thing to be said is that Artemis as a virgin goddess appears to be a somewhat later development, which is sort of an expression of, I suppose, Greek, sexual or gender dynamics. She's a virgin goddess because she's not subject to any man. It's not quite the same thing as being a virgin goddess in the, I suppose, the more literal sort of sense. And if you go back through the more archaic realms of Greek materials, and I don't just mean the scripture, I also mean the archaeological finds, we seem to find a somewhat more complex picture emerging, which presumably partially explains why she's also a patron goddess for pregnancy and safe childbirth. But more upon that can be found in some other work. In terms of the sister situation, in the Vedas we find Rudra held as being the brother of Ambika, Amba. Now, Ambika is, of course, Rudra's wife, so the brother understanding is not intended literally. Effectively, it means sort of a male counterpart, sort of a, from the same DNA in that particular metaphysical regard, not the literal physical regard, obviously. But the point is that I suspect rather strongly this notion of Apollo and Artemis as being sort of brother and sister is not quite meant, at least in the more archaic sense, in the way that it became interpreted later on, when it is literally meant as applies that son and daughter of the Sky Father that we find mentioned as Shani and Bhadra in the Hindu understanding. So, in terms of Apollo protecting Artemis, we can certainly feasibly read it in line with that Proto-Indo-European typology. Now, in terms of the other expressions of this particular myth, what we also see is, once again, this hunting dog turning up quite prominently. So, for example, when Actaeon shows up, and according to sort of somewhat bowdlerized versions of the tale, winds up accidentally catching sight of the goddess bathing. Well, he gets turned into a stag, and that's an important point for later, and then torn to shreds by his own hunting dog or hunting dogs. In fact, the Greeks went to quite some elaborate lengths with their elaboration as to the number and names and other things of the dogs in the later renditions, but we can just sort of pare that back for the moment. We wind up, as I said, with Actaeon being put to death by, effectively divine mandate, with the hunting dog turning upon him in stag form. Now, this is interesting because there's actually another form of the myth which features hunting dogs and this guy Actaeon, wherein Zeus is the one to actually cause all of this to happen. Zeus has Actaeon put to death via the hunting dog because Actaeon is going to interfere with Semele. Semele, as we've mentioned briefly earlier, is mother of Dionysus. Now, Semele, despite the fact that ostensibly this is a human woman, winds up being tricked by a messenger of Hera into asking for a particular boon that winds up burning her to ashes. There's more to that particular story than the frequently encountered form of the myth would actually show you. For a start, there are some versions, even in classical times, whereby Semele doesn't die like that and actually winds up adrift in a chest with the infant Dionysus. I think that version was popular in Sparta for some reason. However, the more interesting thing about it is via our Indo-European comparative mythological analysis, what we can actually see is that Semele, like Zemlya, I think it is in Russian, is an Earth Mother figure. The linguistics are quite clear. And with that in mind, we can see that it's not a sort of a mortal woman that winds up giving birth to Dionysus, but rather it's a goddess taking the seed of the Sky Father once again. Now, just why there's a patrilineal reincarnation element to it is perhaps another matter for another time. But the point is, once again, we see this pattern, whereby somebody's trying to interfere with the wife of the Sky Father, Semele, and therefore is brutally killed by this hunting dog intervention, often with the sort of stag form being quite sort of prominent in the telling as well. Now, the reason why that stag form and that hunting dog element are quite prominent is because, like I've said, that they wind up being reflected or represented in the stars in the Vedic typology, as we'll be discussing. But to just sort of make things a bit sort of clearer, with Orion, this being the adversary Orion we're talking about, this is partially how we know that the form of the myth which these forms of the myth which we're talking about in the Greek end of things are so closely correlate with the Vedic forms and unlock this Proto-Indo-European understanding, because both spheres wound up encoding certain things in the stars. In the case of Orion, we have obviously the constellation Orion. In the case of the dog that's associated with Orion, now, note, once again, this is not Orion's hunting dog in the sense of Orion's good companion, if Orion was the hunter. This is the dog which winds up sort of rending apart Actaeon, etc., rending apart the interloper. That's Sirius, that star, which shows up in somewhat ill-understood Greek archaic rites around Zeus Actaeus. I'll have to check the precise sort of theonym there, but a form of Zeus which has got a very suspiciously similar name to some of the proceedings here, but effectively means Zeus the penetrator, or Zeus the skewerer, we might sort of suggest. It's from the same particle which gives us terms for javelin, and oddly enough, in Old Norse it turns into a term for axe, which we'll be meeting shortly on, but that's another matter. Zeus and Sirius seem to be sort of co-identified, or at least co-evoked in these particular rites, but we'll look at those in due course in another series of pieces. Now we should probably move on to the Vedic typology to start making things a bit clearer. Now we've already met various of the most important participants in this. In a particular 10th mandala Rigveda hymnal, we find the gods being outraged about Prajapati being about to do something which is, it's not done. It's basically, literally translated, something which should not be done, which is to say the sexual impropriety, forcing himself upon his own daughter. Now, this daughter is identified via a number of theonyms, which has somewhat confused things, as of course you should probably expect. Diva, which is to say Dieos in a sort of a feminine linguistic construction, so female counterpart to the Sky Father, is one of the more prominent. However, you also find Ushas, that is to say dawn, being mentioned sort of as another possibility. And in fact, it's somewhat unclear even in the Vedic texts. Like in the Shatapatha, it's the Arya Brahmana. One of the Brahmana sort of commentaries on this, they actually say, well, some say it's Diva, others say that it's Ushas. And of course, in other versions again, you have other understandings for the goddess, like for example, say Sarasvati. It gets quite complex, as you can probably imagine. This is partially because Vedic theonyms are often misunderstood. Some of them are actually titles. So, for example, Prajapati, well, in this particular case, it refers to a particular figure who's often called Prajapati. You also find it as a more freestanding title in some later scripture. So Shiva acquires a Prajapati title. This doesn't mean he is Prajapati, it just means he's got that title. So it's a similar thing, I suspect, with Ushas, whereby Ushas dawn, somewhat cognate with, I think, Yostra, stuff like that. Ushas is, in that particular sense, probably not the Ushas that's a child of the Sky Father, but Ushas, the beauty radiance of the dawn, being a way to refer to sort of the solar goddess that's married to the Sky Father, sort of the radiant queen of the heavens. And we can tell it's a solar goddess in part because, as I said, Diva is literally a feminine form of Dieos. What is Dieos? It's the bright, daylight, shining sky. Anyway, so Prajapati attempts to force himself upon Diva. This horrifies the gods. The gods therefore come together, and none of them think they can actually take on Prajapati and win. individually anyway. So what they do is they emanate their all of their terror, all of their anger into a single form. They congeal, we may say, Rudra, the howling one, the howling of the storm wind. And of course, once again, strongly wolf-associated, as we should of course expect. And a notable archer, Tharva, is the way he's often referred to. Interestingly enough, a term which turns up in the Zoroastrian demonology, because of course, who else are they going to be most afraid of? But in terms of this archer typology, they wind up congealing their forces to express this avenger, or this upholder of cosmic order, who's going to do so by bashing skulls and decapitating the figure in question with his axe. That's the other weapon he's often depicted as armed with. Now, you could argue, I suspect, to go back to the Greek mythology, that the congealment of Orion, this being the the more positive Orion, via three deities, I think from memory it's Zeus, Poseidon, and Hermes, though I'll have to check that, all urinating into a skin. I suspect the urination bit is a slight misunderstanding, but nonetheless, the idea of an emanation of something from these three gods into the one place possibly recalls the same thing that's informed this Vedic understanding, whereby a number of gods assembled pull together their essence, their might, their emotions, if you will, into this one particular Avenger-Destroyer form to take on Prajapati. Now that's the Vedic form, well, one of the Vedic forms of the myth. It's quite a, well, scandalous is possibly the wrong word, it's quite a direct presentation in the 10th mandala hymnal in question, which actually meant that a chap by the name of Ralph Griffith, who gets a lot of hate in various quarters for a number of reasons, most of which I think is completely undeserved. He actually followed the commentary of Sayana reasonably closely in various regards, and attempted to do quite a good job, even though he was working in the late 1800s. But anyway, he was somewhat constrained by the fact that he was writing for a Victorian British audience, so when it comes to these particular lines, there's about 4 of them from memory, he actually presents them entirely in Latin, so he translates from Sanskrit into Latin, which enables him to hide, if you will, the the licentious details of what's actually occurring in this this Vedic scripture. Anyway, I digress. In terms of the Vedic presentations, however, there's, as I say, a number of versions of this particular tale across the later texts. Now, the Brahmana commentaries, they give a lot more detail than Rigvedic hymnals, because that's what they're there for. They're operations manuals, you might say, for how to use particular hymns, how to carry out various rites, and other very useful information which goes with that. So, for example, in the Shatapatha Brahmana, which is the one many people are familiar with, you wind up with them talking about, okay, so when can we set up our ritual fires? When is it proper to do it? Which seasons? And the answer comes down that you got to have regard to the celestial conditions, which constellations, asterisms, nakshatras, are in the sky at that particular point in time. So therefore, some people say, according to this sort of the commentary, when the Kritikas, the Pleiades, also relates to Orion, as some people I'm sure will gather, when the Kritikas are in the sky, it's improper to put out your fires. And the reason for this, so when I say put out your fires, I mean ignite your fires. And the reason for this is because the Kritikas are sort of consorts, if you like, of Agni. And you're invoking Agni when you're carrying out, of course, your fire rites. So if you're invoking Agni when the Kritikas are in the sky, well, you're kind of disrupting his marital relations, and he might be rather annoyed about that, so maybe don't do that. But on the other hand, and this is also in the same text, there's some other arguments that actually it's a pious thing to do because XYZ reasons. I think it might also involve Agni, funny enough, so actually it might be okay. I think there's later on the same section of the Shatapatha Brahmana, which is partially why I mentioned it. There's commentary around whether it's permissible to bring up your fires under Mrigashira. Now, Mrigashira, who we'll be meeting, is the deer head constellation, which is part of Orion, and is also, you might sort of say, the detached head of Prajapati. And similarly, it's quite an important question as to, okay, so considering what this deity did, is it okay for us to actually be carrying out rites of worship during what's, quite a sort of fraught time? But we won't get into that for the moment. The point is that there's a number of reasons why these myths are talked about, preserved, and operationalized, as we shall see later on. Elsewhere in the Shatapatha Brahmana and the Aitareya Brahmana, we find discussion of the myth aforementioned, wherein Prajapati is carrying out this deed not done, and either the gods sort of congealed Rudra to go and sort of execute him, or alternatively, the gods asked Rudra to do it because, well, nobody's mightier than Rudra. And what winds up happening is Rudra, and again this is linked to the constellations, who appears to be Sirius for these purposes. There's some ambiguity going on because, technically speaking, he's both Ardra, the nakshatra, which that means the moist one, so the bringer of rain, effectively, because that's when it occurs in the calendrical cycle, which of course relates to one of the Orion etymologies, which links to that sort of, actually Orion is another descendant of the relevant Proto-Indo-European term, but it's actually more Uranos that we're thinking of there. But anyway, Ardra, linked with Sirius, carries out this act of hunting, tracks down Prajapati, who's in the form of a deer, and slays him using a particular arrow. Now, the other point of ambiguity is whether Tishtreya is involved in this, because Tishtreya is Rudra, and Tishtreya, at least in the Iranic sort of end of things, this is one of those areas where I'm going to say something quite rare. The Iranians, the Persians, the Zoroastrians, actually got something right and preserved it, where some drift appears to have occurred elsewhere in the Indo-European sphere. So let it never be said that I say nothing positive about that particular religious culture, in amidst quite a lot of other deservedly negative things. The Iranians, remember that Tishya, i.e. Tishtreya, is still Sirius, most of the time anyway. It becomes, as I say, a bit complex in Vedic understanding, but more upon that some other time, I think. The point is that Sirius, this dog star, which also has a name that basically connotes the welling up of the furor sort of state, the sort of being seized by things, which goes quite nicely, as you'd expect, with Rudra, the Manu, Odin, and of course his Odur competency, and other things of that particular nature. This hunter shoots Prajapati in deer form with an arrow that's it's referred to as Trikanda, which basically there's a few ways you can translate it, one of which tends to be the arrow with three parts. It's not a bad translation, it's just that I think it misses something. I think the better understanding for Trikanda is 3 points, in fact. Partially because it shows up later on, effectively, with the Trishula of Shiva. Now that Trishula, of course, is a 3 spear, literally. Sort of 3 points is how you basically sort of translate it. It shows up in the constellation as Orion's belt. What we in the West know as the belt of Orion, in Hindu terms, is actually the arrow of Rudra. It's the arrow shot by Ardra, Sirius, which is still sort of sticking out of the side of the Prajapati in deer form. This arrow, of course, this belt, having 3 prominent stars. And, surprise, surprise, in the Shatapatha Brahmana, we find the ritual understanding quite closely reflects this. You basically have 3 fires that are supposed to be set up, one for each of 3 deities that are invoked to congeal this incredible force, which, the Pashupati Astra, we might sort of say, the weapon of the Lord of Beasts. And I suppose you might suggest that in terms of an ultimate huntsman, Lord of Beasts, Lord of the Animals, would be one very interesting way to phrase it. But in terms of the ritual understanding, you carry out these rites which feature the lighting of 3 fires in order to resonate with the 3 celestial fires that formed this arrow of the great god, the great archer. But anyway, that's, as you can see, the constellations helping to confirm that this is the same myth as we find amongst the Greeks, because we have A, Sirius, B, the association of the Orion's belt asterism with effectively the interloper in question, and C, we also have Mrigashira, as I said, in deer form, so like the stag which Actaeon turns into, if you recall, being the victim who was shot at by this archer deity, so Apollo. or sort of torn into, dismembered, etc., things of that particular nature. So it all sort of fits together, and even though some details have shifted, we can confirm that we're fundamentally dealing with the same sort of thing. Now, let's look a bit into some of the later renditions of this particular myth. The latter part of one of the Shatapatha Brahmana invocations of this myth is what happens next. And it features some contretemps over the offering of a ritual oblation, sacrificial portion to Rudra. Does Rudra get a share? If so, how? And, sort of when and stuff. So this particular share that's supposed to go to Rudra is carried around between various other gods and presented to them, and that, sort of, they either don't do anything with it because they're terrified, understandably, of the deity in question, or alternatively, one of them at least, I think, tries to eat it, and winds up with his teeth being kicked in. Well, not literally kicked in, but the teeth wind up basically being broken, or put it that way. My idioms occasionally get away from me. Now, various of those details to what happens there show up in a later Puranic telling. This particular Puranic telling is that of the horse sacrifice of Daksha Prajapati, son of Brahma. And as you can see, there's quite some linkages already apparent. Now, Daksha is mostly known, basically for this horse sacrifice because he was Lord Shiva's father-in-law. The daughter of Daksha in question being Lady Sati. Unfortunately, as is often the case with people and their in-laws, they didn't get on. Daksha considered Shiva to basically be beneath his daughter insofar as it appeared that she'd married some sort of homeless drug addict. Which it's not necessarily correct, but you can see how the perception arose, and that's precisely because Daksha was not really looking past some of the surface manifestations to see the truly great god beneath. Anyway, one thing leads to another, and of course, what winds up happening in the Vayu Purana telling of it, which is somewhat different to various other ones, because it doesn't have Sati dying. In the Vayu Purana telling of it, Rudra is denied a portion of the offering. And therefore, this leads to, following a conversation with his wife about things, Rudra sending Virabhadra. Virabhadra, Bhadra means, good, positive, great, heroic. Vir, it's cognate with Latin vir, as you probably expect, which means man, heroic, those sorts of things. So, great hero would be one translation. Rudra sends this particular emissary figure to basically disrupt with lethal force the sacrifice of Daksha. Eventually, having made his point and fought off the entire rest of the pantheon together, Virabhadra sort of relents, and Daksha basically begs him to allow him to apologize by restaging the rite, with the ritual being consecrated this time, also offering Rudra his appropriate portion. Now, various details, including that particular teeth being broken, etc., in those Puranic tellings closely match up with the situation from the Shatapatha Brahmana's ritual description. So as we can see, it's the same basic myth, except some details have been altered. So, for example, Daksha Prajapati, despite having similar identifying details to Prajapati of the Vedas, doesn't carry out an attempted act of rapacious incest with his daughter. We can give him some credit for at least that. Of course, in other versions of the Puranic versions of the myth, Daksha's daughter Sati does, of course, wind up dying on the offering, the sacrificial pyre. So she winds up basically, I suppose you might almost say, becoming a dark and twisted reflection of the offering, how it's supposed to go with the horse. It's an immensely sad occurrence, as you can probably understand. And also one of the reasons why sati, as in the practice of widow immolation, is not something in the mythology one is supposed to be doing. But we can discuss that at some other point. The point is that it's a bit too late to defend sati at that particular juncture, so it's a revenge operation, a roaring rampage of revenge carried out by Rudra. But as I say, more upon that at some other time. In terms of other Puranic expressions of this myth, the major one is the one that we're actually here to talk about tonight. And that is the emanation of Bhairava to go and deal with this particular circumstance on Rudra's behalf. Now, it's a popular theme in various Puranas. Various Puranas, in fact, have multiple tellings, all there to emphasize particular different elements, if you like, of the myth in question. So some of them vary in various details, some of which are rather more than cosmetic, but the essence is fundamentally consistent. To tell the story, I'll basically just draw from several of them to make things sort of rather clear. We won't do direct scriptural quotations, I think. Now, what happens is Brahma and Vishnu are having a sort of an argument, a debate, a discussion about who's mightier, who's supreme. They're having what we would probably term, with my earlier Proto-Indo-European in mind, a dake measuring contest, because there's some pointing out going on, and it's about pointing out who's superior. It's also a dake measuring contest because, well, we'll meet a certain lingam very shortly. There's a number of different renditions for how this contest was going. One which I quite like, which comes from the Shiva Purana, has them basically arguing back and forth, and then winding up summoning the embodied spirits of all four Vedas to ask the Vedas, sort of, okay, so the Vedas, sort of font of all wisdom and the structure of the universe, who do the Vedas say are supreme? And then all four Vedas say, well, actually, it's Rudra. And you wind up with Vishnu and Brahma being, bewailing the horror that obviously the Vedas have lost all wisdom, so to speak, if that's what they believe. And subsequent detail further ensues, at which, so the Rudra is turned up, and therefore discussion three ways goes. Vishnu winds up going, okay, I recognize this is the supreme, the absolute, all good, I shall bow to my superior. Brahma, by contrast, doesn't take the hint, and winds up doing a number of things, initially with sort of attempted counter-arguments, effectively saying, and this is a bit of a theme, dresses like a homeless drug addict, comes across like a crazy person, has sex, interestingly enough. Therefore, how can he possibly be beyond attachments? How can he possibly be the absolute? Now, at that particular point, when that last allegation comes up, Rudra's wife chimes in, and it basically sort of gets said, well, yes, he does, but it's with his other half, i.e. me, so, that's not an objection, man. But in terms of sort of the other objections, they basically do get answered. It all comes up around, pointing out that they don't really have any bearing beyond surface appearances. And when you're talking about, the absolute in cosmic terms, surface appearances are quite a worrisome thing to get tangled up in, because they can lead you severely astray. It's the delusion of Maya, rather than Maya as the magical potency which sustains the cosmos, but more upon that some other time. Anyway, the major version is a bit different. It basically involves Brahma and Vishnu encountering a pillar of light. This is the Lingodbhava incident. It's like a Jyotirlingam, a column of starlight, we might sort of say. Although lingam, well, you can translate it a few ways. One of which, yes, is phallus, we might sort of say, or a herm, perhaps, in the Greek sense of things. One way, I say, not the only way. So when I talk about a dake measuring contest, well, this is basically what happens. Brahma and Vishnu wind up holding a race to see who's supreme. The deity who can get to the end of the lingam in question first will be the supreme. Now, what happens is it's an infinite lingam. It basically runs from outside the universe at both ends, if you will, i.e. not ends, so, above and beyond. It's an immanency of the absolute into our reality. That's why it has no beginning and end. It's like Yggdrasil, in fact, quite directly in terms of having roots no one knows, you might sort of say. This also, as a brief side point, is it's the axis mundi. Hence why lingams, shivlings, that's why we worship them in the way that we do, in exactly the same manner as turns up in Nordic texts, whereby they pour libations of a white liquid to help to sort of support and maintain Yggdrasil. We offer milk, we offer panchamrut, same sort of understanding. We're protecting the immanency of cosmic order within our world by looking after the axis mundi, we may say. But again, I digress, and there are some Greek understandings that we'll do a video on that at some point, I'm sure. In terms of this race, however, what winds up happening, as I say, is it goes nowhere, because how do you reach the infinite? How do you transcend it? You can't, unless you're the infinite yourself, of course. So Devi may have been able to, but that's an entirely different understanding as to how and why Devi winds up on top of the lingam in question, if you get my drift. Anyway, Brahma and Vishnu running in opposite directions. Vishnu concludes eventually, this is just, it's not running out, there's no end to this. I give up. He surrenders to the fact that the infinite is insurmountable. Brahma, by contrast, the arrogant sort that he is, goes, yeah, I'm just going to lie about finding the end. So basically they reconvene somewhere in the middle, and Brahma goes, yep, I found the end. All good. There's some details I'm glossing over here about a flower, but some other time. Now, Vishnu, being a trusting sort, we might sort of say, goes, okay, cool, you found the end of it, that's great, I acknowledge your evident superiority, you're obviously the supreme. Milestone, that kind of thing. Except, of course, it was a lie. And as we've established, this is a bit of a violation of cosmic order in certain sorts of senses. It's a druj. Druj, I think, is the Avestan. It literally means sort of a pollution as well as a lie, and can, in fact, refer to a class of demons and infliction, and is etymologically cognate with draugr in Old Norse, i.e. undead, but that's another matter for another time, as I keep sort of saying. I thought it was going to cut down the number of digressions, evidently not. What winds up happening is, as we should expect, a very sort of bemused Rudra winds up turning up to set things to right, as you've probably gathered, as the actual supreme in this particular instance. Now, what winds up happening is Brahma does not, in fact, yield his claim of supremacy. In fact, it goes quite the other way. He looks at the Shiva that has turned up and says, yeah, no, I'm supreme over you too. He points to a number of those facts, like we've aforementioned, including the fact of them both having 5 heads in these particular iconographic depictions, and therefore goes, yeah, okay, so we're at least equivalent. That means I can start doing your job. This causes what we might call chaos in the cosmos, because Brahma shouldn't be doing that particular set of jobs, and, it's a case of too many cooks, we might sort of suggest. Now, it actually then gets worse, because as Brahma has concluded that he is, in fact, Shiva, because, that they're equivalent in his mind, this therefore means that first up he can, or greater than Shiva, because he's both Shiva and Brahma in his own mind, he offers protection to Rudra. So it's a calculated insult of saying, don't worry, you can be under my protection because I'm greater than you. And further, what he winds up doing is, because he thinks that he is Rudra, he winds up looking at Rudra's wife and going, yeah, so since I'm you, yeah, I'm going to be having some of that. He starts making allegations about, well, you can probably imagine the sort of things which he says about Rudra's wife. And if there is one thing you absolutely do not ever do, it is insult or attempt to interfere with Rudra's wife. If she doesn't kill you herself, her very angry husband most assuredly will. This leads to Rudra emanating an avenger or a destroyer form. Now, the accounts somewhat differ about this, but the version which I like has him basically taking a single fingernail and casting it down where it grows into this black, terrifying destroyer form, that being, of course, KaalBhairav, who we are worshipping tonight. Now, the way I like to interpret that, of course, is somewhat figurative, and effectively it has Shiva having more power in one of his fingernails than Brahma does in his entire body. Because what does this small emanation of the greatness that is Rudra then do? Well, armed with an axe, the traditional weapon of Rudra when it's not being a bow or a spear, armed with an axe, he goes and cuts Brahma's ego down to size. And by cuts his ego down to size, I mean he decapitates one of Brahma's heads, because, of course, that whole 5-head thing is partially why Brahma thought that he was equivalent to Lord Shiva. So, problem solved, you'd think. Because what winds up happening is, of course, decapitation in Hindu iconographic terms stands for overcoming ego. The head is where ego is, so therefore pride can get in your pride and ego can get in your way for enlightenment, cause you to not see what's actually there. Decapitation, therefore, overcoming ego, enables you to think more clearly, which we also see, for example, with the iconographic symbolism for Ma as Chinnamasta, the Tantrika Devi. Although in that particular case, she's self-decapitating rather than sort of having it done by somebody else. Long story, some other time. Anyway, what winds up happening is Brahma becomes enlightened and realizes that no, he isn't the supreme, nor is he Rudra. And having been cut back down to size, he goes, okay, well, I screwed up. I'd better be praying rather hard for forgiveness then and acknowledging the true master of the universe, that of course being Rudra. And yeah, it's basically sort of not so much no harm, no foul, as Brahma is allowed to go on living. Although, due to his previous conduct, there's various different interpretations about the nature of the curse which winds up laden upon him. But in terms of why there aren't very many Brahma temples, that's part of the reason, is because his conduct there in the previous sort of proceedings rendered him unsuitable to be worshipped in that particular regard. So there are some lasting consequences, but at the same time, Lord Shiva is pleased by his penance, and therefore, to a certain extent, somewhat forgives him, and that's why Brahma is not completely killed. However, this is where the real story of KaalBhairav Jayanti really sort of kicks off, because while we have all of these rather abstract and arcane typologies that we can deploy about comparative mythological analysis for Brahma Brahma being decapitated by Bhairava, and then matching that up to Rudra attacking Prajapati and Apollo shooting Orion and Actaeon being torn apart by hunting dogs, etc. Those don't necessarily tell us too much about what we should be doing as ordinary devotees. We can engineer some stuff out of them, particularly in terms of those ritual understandings. But part of the reason why I like KaalBhairav Jayanti, which I'm egregiously mispronouncing, is because it has a pathway for action for any one of us to a certain extent. And it's built around, funny enough, atonement and cosmic order, which we earlier met in terms of that particular goddess figure. To briefly add some points to it, the wife of Rudra being cosmic order, a lot more direct than it is even in the Greek end of things. Vachdevi, per the wonderful theology of Sayana, excellent Vedic commentator, it's quite explicit, it's quite expressed. That's partially why she is voice. Vach, voice, you can see the direct cognate relationship, because she is giving voice to active expression of Rita, cosmic order as absolute, into this universe of ours. It is also why she empowers the core essence of Rudra and enables him to actually be able to do various of these mighty deeds, per the Devi Sukta, RV X125, which I must mention at least once per video or article, as of course we've seen elsewhere. But in terms of this situation, the thing about cosmic order is that it comes with its own enforcement clause. Now, on some occasions where this is necessary, it's a quite formidable male deific, as we've seen with Rudra turning up to mete out the sanction which is aforementioned. And that's terrifying enough. However, there's also a correlate understanding where it's at least one, and occasionally more than one, black avenging forms of the goddess, often some snake association. The Greeks knew of these as the Erinyes, and of course Demeter Erinyes, when she was in a black furor form, raging and rampaging and causing quite immense death, as we've discussed elsewhere. My contention is that the Germanic understanding of this gives us Skati. We can tell this is likely the same, I suppose you might say, myth which is being expressed, because once again it's a dark by name. The name is somewhat correlated with shadow, if I remember correctly. A dark sort of form of the goddess is married to Odin, per various Germanic sources upon the subject, and in terms of what she does to Loki, she's the one that's responsible for placing the serpent above Loki, which drips poison into his eyes in that cave where he's imprisoned. And of course is a huntress, entirely uncoincidentally. I also suspect Artemis has some resonance with this for reasons I've discussed elsewhere, but we'll move on. In terms of this black avenging form, so the ultimate enforcement clause of cosmic order, it also turns up in less, deifically sort of personified, but still personified form as well. In this particular case, once Bhairava has carried out the decapitation of Brahma, well, the issue is that Brahma is a Brahmin, as you probably expect. So therefore, Bhairava has carried out the sin of Brahmahatya, which is to say the killing of a Brahmin. Even though Brahma is not dead, the decapitation is still pretty close. So therefore, Brahmahatya, a personified form of Brahmahatya, in fact, rises out of the earth, note that, with some sort of serpentine description in some versions, if I remember correctly, and pursues Bhairava. So what winds up happening then is Bhairava has to undertake a series of acts of penance in order to dissipate the burden of sin which he has accrued. Now there's some interesting stuff there because ostensibly Bhairava was acting in defense of cosmic order. In fact, he was acting with a divine mandate. In fact, he is the divine mandate because Shiva had directly sent him to carry out the act in question. So if you think about it, it would seem somewhat strange that having defended cosmic order, Bhairava winds up being sanctioned by cosmic order to be pursued all over the universe by this dreadful pursuing consequence of his own actions. And this speaks towards the complex and nuanced manner in which cosmic order actually works in Indo-European understanding. Breaking the law in order to uphold the law is a contradiction in terms. It's a paradox, and a necessary one at that. Don't get me wrong. It's a righteous action in this particular regard, especially because the greater purpose that is given voice to via this act. But that doesn't change the fact that the law was broken, even though it was broken in order to be ultimately upheld. Hence, it's inescapable that these sorts of consequences ensue, so therefore there's no sort of shortcut to it. And atonement must be carried out. Now, atonement, in Indo-European comparative mythological terms, is often a symbolic act of restitution, whereby if you do something wrong, what you've got to do is make things right with the thing that you harmed. In this particular case, the reason why Brahmahatya is such an egregious sin is because a proper Brahmin is himself a saliency or an immanency of cosmic order and the absolute in this universe of ours. That's partially why, the etymology on Brahmin appears to derive from the same Proto-Indo-European term which gives us Germanic words like berg. That's the B-E-R-G, I should say, although the B-U-R-G, long story. Berg as in mountain, high place, because of course that's what you find with this absolute. It is the high, right? So therefore, in order for Bhairava to make peace with the sin that he's committed, to carry out this atonement, this restitution, he must make peace with the absolute and its immanentization. Now, this isn't as simple as simply turning back to Shiva and saying, right, we're cool, although ultimately it kind of is in a more sort of drawn-out sort of fashion. What it in fact involves is a journey of self-discovery. That's partially why it's atonement, because it's at one meant, to reference me some Joseph Campbell in that particular sort of regard. It's literally making oneself hale and whole again. The burden of sin is carried with one until it sort of falls away. But in terms of the actual mythology around it, which is probably useful to walk through, I'll basically just read from my 2017 article. Now, some understandings have developed in the interim, but it'll probably make it easier for me to keep my meandering, my wandering, to a minimum. The remedy for this was a period of wandering as a mendicant, Bhikshatana, a beggar, using the skull of Brahma, which had become stuck to his hand, as a visual sign of his crime, as a begging bowl, a kapala. Kapala can both mean skull and also sort of an alms bowl. To ask for alms, a practice replicated in some measure by the Kapalikas, the skull men, a sect of Shaivites, many of whom, at least originally, were actually carrying out a criminal sentence of spending 12 years as such for inadvertently killing a Brahmin, before its subsequent evolution into a devotional path of sorts. Eventually, he's to acquire absolution upon reaching the city of Kashi, that being Varanasi, which the Brahmacharya pursuer was unable to enter. Now, for these various sorts of reasons, Lord Bhairava is often prayed to as a patron protector of travellers, particularly at night. Now, during this period of wandering, Lord KaalBhairava also slays Vishvaksena, the seneschal or general of Lord Vishnu's realm and armies, for attempting to obstruct his quest, before engaging in dialogue with Lord Vishnu about the nature of his sin and reality. Accounts differ as to the precise nature of the attempted assistance rendered by Lord Vishnu to Bhairava at this point, with some suggesting that Lord Vishnu offers his own blood to attempt to fill the skull cup with, and others instead having Lord Vishnu split open one of Bhairava's veins to do likewise. Wherever the blood flew from, however, it is insufficient to fill the cup, regardless of how much is poured in or for how long, this representing the difficulty of applying quick fixes or self-sought solutions of improper nature in cases where wrongdoing must be amended for. The dialogue continues with Lord KaalBhairava making the astute observation, according to at least one source, that the alms given to the truly pious beneficiary or beggar do not lead him to corrupt beliefs, intoxication, and worldly ensnarement, but rather aid and facilitate the pursuit of truth. This culminates in Lord Vishnu realizing that even despite the seemingly degenerate outward appearance and habits of Bhairava, as an extension somewhat of the same of Lord Shiva, and his self-imposed status as an egregious sinner, that nevertheless Lord Shiva is the supreme, with these outer elements not impeding, contaminating, or weighing down the actual truth and essence of Mahadeva. For his part, Lord Vishnu is acknowledged as the foremost disciple of Lord Shiva, something which turns up in a number of perhaps peculiarly Vaishnava texts as well. Vishnu then directs KaalBhairava to head to Varanasi, the present-day Hindu city of the dead, which is also an actual city located upon the banks of the Ganges in Uttar Pradesh, in case you were wondering. It's also known as Kashi, the city of light, in order to perform the appropriate penitential ritual there, and at last be free from his Kapalika burden of obligation. This Bhairava does, with the Brahmacharya fading into the ground after following him to the gates of the city, and the skull of Brahma also falling from his hand at the place now known as Kapalamochana, liberation from the skull. The KaalBhairava is said to remain in Varanasi to this day as an especial protector of the city, and also its continual population of pilgrims and death seekers. It's considered the best and most appropriate place to die by many Hindus, with funeral pyres lighting the banks of the Ganges nightly. On this particular night, annually, the KaalBhairava Murti in the temple to him at Varanasi is fully uncovered. It's usually veiled apart from the head for most of the year, and adorned with a mundamala, that is to say, a necklace of skulls made of silver. Elsewhere in the world, KaalBhairav Jayanti is observed by Hindus with all-night vigils, which we're currently performing, it being about 3:23 in the morning here, the chanting of particular devotional liturgies, and perhaps most heartwarmingly, performing acts of kindness to dogs, as a dog is the vahana, the vehicle or the mount of Bhairava, and as we've previously discussed, there's quite strong dog or wolf symbolism going on with the form of the avenging form of the Skyfather deific involved from the previous forms of the myth. So, of course, acting in kindness to the on-earth expression of them, the resonancy in iconographic forms, is quite understandable. It is thought that, in line with KaalBhairava's example, that proper penance performed and properly meant in Kashi, and within his sight, is capable of providing absolution for even the more egregious of sins committed by mortal man. And while the necessity of following infringement and violation of propriety with appropriate conduct to set things right is an obvious moral to the story of Bhairava, that is only the most obvious insight to be gained here. The supremacy of Lord Shiva, and his eventual Occasionally somewhat indirect or seemingly arduous methods for bestowing enlightenment upon all is another one. But looking closer, and particularly at specific parts of the myth, we also see that the truth can be found in seemingly unexpected places. As Vishnu notes upon realizing that despite appearing as a sinner, this is precisely what Lord Shiva is. The truth, that is. And for that matter, what Lord Brahma is forced to acknowledge and realize, even after directly scoffing at the notion of the Supreme being engaged in the lifestyle and outer habits of Mahadev. Alongside this, the idea of the truth being terrifying in some instances, particularly if we continually refuse to face up to it. Whereupon this denial can have potentially deadly results of escalating severity. All of this is plainly demonstrated in this myth. We also see that no being, whether god or man, can outrun the consequences of his actions. We can instead only choose how to respond to them. This may seem a peculiar maxim to draw out from the myth, given KaalBhairava literally spends the latter part of the legend outpacing his pursuer, the Brahmahacha. And yet the reality of the situation is that not only did Bhairava have to run from this, i.e. the pursuit and the resultant wandering was a consequence that could not be simply eschewed and easily gotten out of, but that only the proper ritual penitence in the proper place, i.e. righteous action to set things right and equalize the aforementioned sin and consequence, set things back into balance, was capable of abjuring the much-feared consequence in question, and thus the necessity of doing so was a consequence in and of itself. Now, in terms of what I'm getting at there, partially it's the fact that Kashi, as Lord Shiva's city, in fact, so much Lord Shiva's city that at the Pralaya, the apocalypse, the Ragnarok, if you will, the burning down of the tapestry of the universe, we have fabric of reality, meant quite mytho-literally, you might sort of say. Varanasi is one of the few places that survives the burning. It is similar to, I think it's called Hodmimmer's Holt in the Nordic understanding. There is the place where the ancestors, the Pitras, basically sort of survive precisely because it's above those lower destructions of the illusory, the world around us. So you can see why it's quite necessary that in terms of reconciliation with the Absolute and the saliency of the Absolute in this universe, carrying out those penitential rites and offerings in Varanasi was the necessary thing to do. And you can also see that in terms of Bhairava being hailed as the Absolute, or an expression thereof, by Vishnu, that was part of it as well, because of course the idea of becoming at peace with situations, even despite one's previous sins and seemingly egregious misdeeds, whether they were or not is another matter, that atonement, making oneself comfortable and able to face up to one's darker side, is a necessary component of this too. I'm not saying it's forgiving oneself, although somebody with Harihara conceptualization would probably suggest that as applies Vishnu observing this about a form of Rudra, there would be a forgiving oneself element going on there. No, but in terms of what we're getting at here, it's that symbolic act whereby the thing that has been wronged is propitiated, is set back right, set back into balance. But anyway, getting back to the reading. For it cannot have been unintentional that the god of creation, or one of them anyway, Lord Brahma, would find himself laid low by time, KaalBhairava. This echoes both the notion of that which is created, including our material universe, eventually eroding and being destroyed through the progress of time, as well as recalling the role of Mahakali at the end of time, wherein she plays a key role in unmaking the great work which Lord Brahma has, in some tellings of the cosmological or cosmogonical, more properly, set into motion. Other tellings, of course, have other figures involved, as you can probably appreciate, which also itself recalls the role of Lord Shiva as the destroyer, responsible for unmaking and bringing to an end creation in order to clear the space for the next cycle to begin. Everything that has a beginning has an end, and one which comes with appropriately enough time. This also suggests, depending upon one's metaphysical inclination, another illustration of Lord Shiva's superiority over Lord Brahma, in that this tacitly connects with the eschewing of the mortal material world for that which is greater, supreme, eternal, as after the dissolution of the world, All that is left is the absolute. And as applies the name, well, what is it that we humans tend to fear? Death. It's certainly an obvious one, the transcension of which is often considered an important part of the improving of a soul, as revealed through Lord Brahma, becoming more enlightened following his decapitation, i.e. moving past losing his head and ego, at least somewhat. But so too is blackness, something we fear, whether in the sense of the unknown or the dark night, which might effectively shroud same. So, for instance, the Navadurga of Kalaratri, for a similar embodiment of the concept here. Yet as we can see from both KaalBhairava, as well as other associated aspects and divinities, truth and wisdom can quite frequently be found out there in the same, in the dark of the night, even if we might initially resile from its prospect thence. We also tend inevitably, appropriately there, to fear time, and more especially its passage, as this is the keenest revealer of the impermanence of our decidedly mortal existences, as well as, on a more macroscopic level, the unmaker of all things. It is, after all, the fire in which we burn, Kalagni Rudraya. The notion of wasted time or squandered years, although in a bit of an inversion on occasion, not so much misspent youth, as the gulf between said youth and the present day eroded by time, all of this tends to scare, although is perhaps necessary impeller towards proper action and better use of this most precious of resources, thus once again showing the necessary and indeed noble role of terror. All of this then, even without getting into some of the more creative etymologies and meanings that some sages have put forward for the name of KaalBhairava, all of this helps to show why we meditate upon Lord Shiva as Bhairava on this particular night. And so with that in mind, and having been recording for over an hour, it would appear, we shall bring our observances here to a close, which shall hopefully enable me to get up to my shrine and carry out my own more proper and conventional obeisances and offerings as the night proceeds on towards dawn. Hail to the Terra, whose Vahana is a dog. Om Namah Shivaya, Jai Sri Rudra. Thank you.